Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. And in this programme we'll be asking, is Israel heading for a constitutional crisis after the coalition government passed legislation to reform Israel's judiciary that is potentially tearing Israeli society apart, and we'll be unpacking the issues surrounding judicial reform. Regan, it's great to be recording another programme, and I've been really watching Israel really since the early 90s. And I've never known a time in Israel where Israeli society is so polarised. There are so many divisions over judicial reform and the question of how much power does Israel's judiciary have, and how this is also wrapped up in the vision of the state, whether it's the secular left or the religious right. And it seems like Israeli society is completely polarized at this current time, that it's actually endangering Israel's security, because Israel's enemies, such as Iran and Iranian terror proxies, look at this situation and see a divided Israel, a society tearing itself apart as a weak nation, possibly ready for invasion.
Yeah, it's a very critical time at the moment, Simon, and I don't know anyone personally who is happy with where things are, where things look to be headed, apart, that is, from those distant individuals who are from the extreme right generally within Israeli politics. So the religious Zionist organizations and factions will be very keen on these judicial reforms, as the fear of many, those who are of Christian or of other more centrist type backgrounds going on towards, as you already mentioned, the left-wing and secular Israelis are concerned that the ultra-religious Zionist political parties gain predominant power through this. So my wife is Israeli, and her general take on this is it's been difficult enough to be a follower of Jesus, Jewish or Christian, in Israel as it is. This could very well open the gates to making it that much more difficult, that much worse for those who follow Jesus in the land of Israel, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, because it could see the Sabbath observance rules and requirements enforced in a much stricter way, other elements of the religious side being imposed on those who aren't as religious.
But that's the whole problem, isn't it? I think you've identified the whole problem with this judicial reform that the current coalition government is proposing, is that no one really knows what is being proposed. And that is the problem.
No one has a clue.
It's the interpretation of judicial reform, because
it could actually be a very good thing.
Well, I believe it is a good thing, because as we unpack through the program, we kind of realised that Israel was in urgent need of a judicial reform.
Right.
But we're also seeing politically, though, that the judicial reform and the judiciary is being weaponized.
Correct.
Pretty much to try and bring down Netanyahu's government, because he's been there so long, they want to curb his powers. But then that's completely out of sync with democracy. But then you have the other fears, like you mentioned, particularly also from secular Israelis, who actually fear that if this judicial reform is being carried out by the ultra-nationalist religious parties who are in power at the moment, they could close shops, restaurants, everything on Shabbat. They could turn the electricity on Shabbat, that this would be an end to their secular life. And I think only by living in Israel and understanding the complexities of Israeli society do you realize that the judicial reform is like a fault line that runs right through Israeli society, dividing the left from the right, the religious from the secular, the Ashkenazi from the Sephardi. And it's this point now is becoming a kind of, it's like a touch paper ready to ignite. And we all knew that these divisions were under the surface, but these divisions are being kept down from the threats that Israel faces in living in the most dangerous region of the world. we saw similar things emerge during 2000 during the Camp David peace accords, where Israel was on the brink of making a peace agreement with Yasser Arafat and the PLO and the creation of a Palestinian state, that a lot of these social issues come to the fore. So the fact that Israelis are so passionate about this topic is because of how they interpret it, whether it's from the religious right or the secular left, will determine what your view is on judicial reform. So let's just unpack some of this. So the government, back on, I think, the 24th of July, passed its controversial judicial reform legislation by 64 votes to 0 as the opposition walked out in protest. We'll also be unpacking why reforming Israel's judiciary is polarising the nation and what this means for the future of Israeli democracy. The judicial reforms proposals also run through the fault lines in Israeli society and go to the very heart and identity of the Jewish state. It's predominantly the secular and the left in Israel that are opposing this legislation, where the religious and the right are pushing for legal reforms to give the Prime Minister more power and to prevent the left, through the Supreme Court, of vetoing government policies and actions.
It's important that we understand, trying to look a little bit, even if we can't understand it fully, the history of the judiciary in Israel. One of the things I find both frustrating and amusing at the same time is when I inquire of Israelis in Israel, what's going on, what is the proposed reform, what's the change. There's never any specific answer. There's not always an understanding of what this could actually lead to, as we've just mentioned. So it helps to go back and analyze a little bit of the history here. According to the State of Israel official website, the Supreme Court in Jerusalem is the highest court of Israel and the final court of appeals, very much like our own. The court consists of 15 justices and 2 registrars. The head of the Supreme Court and of the whole judicial system is the president of the Supreme Court. The current president of the Supreme Court in Israel is Justice Esther Hayut, and she's currently serving in that position. Appeal is a right against civil, criminal, and administrative judgments rendered in the district courts at the first instance, including when sitting as a court of administrative matters, court of admiralty, standard contracts tribunal, and as an antitrust tribunal. 2 applications for leave to appeal against civil, criminal, and administrative judgments rendered on appeal from the magistrates' courts in the district courts and the military court of appeals, and applications for leave to appeal against other decisions that are not judgments of the district courts. Leave to appeal is granted by the court discretion in accordance with the criteria set out in legislation and case law. The relevant factors also depend on the nature of the proposed appeal. So very much like, just trying to boil it down in layman's terms, very similar to our own system in some ways. A lot of it's rooted in that appeals process. So the Supreme Court deals with, it's the final place, essentially, of appeal.
Similar to the US Supreme Court as well?
Very similar. Very, very, very similar. Now, as the High Court of Justice, the Bagats, the Supreme Court hears petitions by any person, not only citizens or residents, against public bodies and governmental authorities. In this context, the types of cases heard by the Supreme Court include constitutional and administrative petitions for judicial review of decisions and actions of the authorities and of legislation, petitions directed against judgments pronounced in the National Labor Court, in the Supreme Rabbinical Court, and in other religious courts. So this is where it begins to get a little different, because there are religious courts in Israel. There's rabbinical court as well. We don't really have a system that's quite as equivalent to that outside of our own independent ecclesiastical bodies. Generally speaking, the Supreme Court sits in panels of 3. However, a single justice may hear certain matters, including interlocutory applications, temporary orders, and applications for leave to appeal. In cases of special importance, the Supreme Court can sit as an expanded panel with an uneven number of judges. And of course, that's so you can have a deciding vote. There's not going to be any stalemate. And the President of the Supreme Court and other justices in certain cases may order the following: a further hearing with expanded panel of judgment rendered by the Supreme Court. This power exercised only in rare cases where the precedent is inconsistent with previous rulings of the Supreme Court or is of special importance. It can also be a retrial in a criminal case where a final ruling has been made. This only occurs in exceptional and very rare cases in which new facts have come to light or concern has arisen that an injustice was done to the accused. Approximately 10,000 proceedings are initiated in the Supreme Court annually. About 40% of these are the main proceedings. In other words, proceedings generally heard before a panel of judges, criminal, civil, and administrative appeals and petitions to begats. The remainder of the proceedings, about 60%, are cases that are genuinely heard before a single justice. Now, all of that seems fairly straightforward, Simon, when we're thinking about it, talking about it. Of course, every court's going to have its issues, and there's always that potential for corruption. Why is it that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wants to reform the judiciary?
I think the answer to that is because it curbs his powers. And what we see is that the Supreme Court and the judiciary are not elected, they're appointed. It's ideologically driven to protect the interests of the left. And any policies that the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu might pursue, then the Supreme Court can overturn that decision. And therefore, this affects his ability to govern as Prime Minister. It affects the authority and the power of the Prime Minister's office. And so therefore, you get on controversial issues, kind of very, very big turf wars. So this is effectively why he wants to deal with this. There's also that personal issue of him being indicted by the courts, and it's being kind of weaponized. He wants to take that out of the equation, and he wants to ensure also that there's balance within Israel's judiciary and the Supreme Court, so it's kind of more reflective of Israeli society rather than a stronghold of the secular left in Israel.
Just to play the devil's advocate, so to speak, on that, is it not fair to say that the vast majority of Israel's population is defined by the non-Orthodox, the non-religious?
I would say so. But when it comes down to kind of elections, what happens is we see the ultra-Orthodox fly in from London or New York or else around the world to actually place their votes. And this is why predominantly we see that Netanyahu's got such a religious coalition, because all these problems also, whether it's, for example, the last 4 years of having multi-general elections and failure of governments to actually stand, is because Benjamin Netanyahu is in power. And he effectively has burnt his coalition partners because no one wants to work with him again. So he then had to go to the religious right in order to form a government. And some of these individuals are some of the most extreme political leaders in the makeup of the Israeli Knesset or parliament in order to form a government. Now, it's a legitimate government. They won. The Likud became the largest party in the last election back in November of 2022. So he's able to form a government. It's a stable government because they have enough votes to pass through legislation. And they kind of feel that, that Israeli society is shifting more towards the religious and more towards the religious right, and the left is losing its influence and its power base. And of course, then it's the interpretation of how this legislation is seen. And I think you've also got to understand so much within Israeli society of what the secularists, mainly those living on the coastlands of Israel, Tel Aviv, Netanya, Herzliya, that area view the religious right. I mean, you've got two different worlds in Israel, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Two totally different worlds. You could say two totally different societies, even though they're Jewish, living alongside each other with two different views on how the country should be run and governed. And of course, then it's all pretty much interpretation of the judicial reform.
A Northern Kingdom and a Southern Kingdom.
Yeah, well, yeah.
In modern day.
Yeah.
Do you think, Simon, if you look at it, that the primary issue is who's trying to pass this judicial reform? Because I for years, have even read articles for years. Even I mentioned my own wife's concern with some of this. There's been a recognition that the lawmakers and the judges have far too much power in Israel. They control so much. The prices are where they are because of corruption often in the judiciary and various decisions that are made that are generally in favor of particular families and parties within the nation. If this wasn't being pushed through by Benjamin Netanyahu, particularly in coalition with an extreme religious Zionist party headed by Ben Gvir, do you think we'd be having the mass
No, that's
protest?
the idea. That's the idea. But also we see with outsiders can actually coming in to help fund the massive protests as a mean to destabilise the government and to bring about the fall of Netanyahu's government, because it's not a globalist government. So we have also outside forces playing their part in this decision to reform the judiciary. So yes, exactly. I think it's on who's proposed it. Why could you say that, for example, when Yair Lapid was Prime Minister, why didn't he seek to reform the judiciary then? But predominantly it's been the right that has held power really since 2009.
Up to that point, it was always the left.
No, up until the left lost its power after 1999 with the Second Intifada. So the Labour Party is a kind of shadow of it was. I mean, this was the governing party of David Ben-Gurion that dominated from Israel's War of Independence 48 right up until that incredible election in 77 when Menachem Begin won the election for the Likud for the first time. And then we start to see the influence wane. We see, for example, the election of Yitzhak Rabin in 92 and Shimon Peres as his foreign minister was probably the last time that the left had real power and dominance in Israeli society. Shimon Peres, we know Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. Shimon Peres becomes prime minister, loses the election because they changed the rules where you directly elect the prime minister in a one-off election. So Netanyahu won that. Then we see that he loses power in 99 and Ehud Barak becomes prime minister and offers virtually gives away almost the entirety of Israel's biblical heartland, Judea and Samaria, followed by then the most horrific Second Intifada or suicide war against Israel. And that's when the Israeli people start to realise that we can't afford to have land for peace. This is where we see the demise of the left-wing parties. Right. And the majority of Israelis then decide to put their faith and their trust in Likud and Benjamin Netanyahu because he's tough on security issues. And of course, it's that only when we saw this coalition government formed with Bennett and also with Yair Lapid, did we see the left then kind of have that power over government again in the Prime Minister's office. So
in theory, in the future, in a future election, the decision made now just shifts in favor of whatever government comes in then. So what is the angst and what is the issue in a democratic society? Is there a fear, and I've seen this in various headlines, that Israel is going to cease to be democratic?
Well, that's lies, because it's all about interpretation. And this is why these, I think this debate has become so ferocious in Israel, because it's about interpretation.
Right.
It's not about what the actual facts on the ground. I mean, we've already seen that the proposal put out by Benjamin Netanyahu, and also Benjamin Netanyahu has another problem. He can't actually work on this reform of the judiciary because he's pending a legal indictment himself. So he's not permitted to actually work on this. So this is where the confusion is. So who effectively in the Israeli government is actually running and proposing the reforms of the legal system, because Benjamin Netanyahu can't do it. So is someone else doing it? And this is where the confusion brings in, and it's all interpreted on the lens of which political party, what your religious beliefs are, what your nationalistic beliefs are, and it's interpreted through that prism, which makes it so complicated. So according to Alex Chelman, who's the CEO of JNS, which is the Jewish News Syndicate, writing under the title of Long Overdue Judicial Reform, finally underway, states that for decades, Israel's Supreme Court, under the leadership of Aaron Barak, has amassed increasing authority in landmark, self-defined rulings, shifting the delicate balance of power between the three branches of government in its favour. He says the self-proclaimed judicial revolution determined that any issue, legal, procedural, or otherwise, is justifiable. It allows for practitioners to bring cases to the court without standing, enables the court to cancel legislation, force the Knesset to pass laws, hamstrings the activities of the Prime Minister and his or her cabinet, and as well as instituted without a majority of votes in the Israeli parliament known as the Knesset.
Now, what the Israeli government is proposing in terms of legal reforms is important to discuss. It's just one component of a larger package introduced by the government several months ago. Amid protests and pressures from all sectors of society by those uncomfortable with the right-wing makeup of Israel's democratically elected coalition, Netanyahu rescinded the larger reform package. He and his coalition partners then engaged the opposition in weeks of negotiations headed by Israeli President Isaac Herzog, aimed at reaching a broad-based compromise arrangement.
And we have two excellent CBN news reports to go to on how the Israeli government has actually passed the legislation to reform Israel's judiciary.
The opposition maintains this judicial reform proposal will weaken the Supreme Court and open a path to dictatorship. Israeli author Yuval Noah Harari lays out this scenario.
With the Supreme Court neutralized, the government could easily rig the elections, for example, by denying Arab citizens voting rights or by closing down all independent media outlets. Israel will still hold elections, just as Russia holds elections, but it will become a dictatorship.
Yet supporters of the legislation say it reins in a runaway Supreme Court.
I came here to support democracy. Democracy means the rule of the government elected by the people and agreed by the people, and not a regime in which the Supreme Court takes rights that it doesn't have.
Ohad Tal, a member of the coalition, tells CBN News he believes the legislation actually strengthens democracy by rebalancing Israel's government.
Of course, you have to have a strong court. No one doubts that. But the question is, who's going to make the policies of the country? Is it going to be a small group of people, or is it going to be the people by their representatives?
Tal says many opposition members quietly favor this judicial reform, and their past actions prove it.
I know what people are saying in the closed rooms. From the opposition, many people are agreeing with the fact that we need to have these reforms, and you don't have to trust me about that. You just have to read the bills that many of the opposition members of today put on the table only in the last few years, which proves that they are supporting exactly what we're trying to promote today.
The protest began more than 7 months ago, but some believe the goals are more than just legislation on judicial reform. Israel's public diplomacy minister tweeted that former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, a major protest leader, aims to overthrow the government. Earlier this year, Barak cited research examining protests for the last 100 years and how they succeeded.
They found a common denominator, all these protests which succeeded, where they reach a level of 3.5% of the population, tenaciously and persistently keeping the protests, boycott, civil disobedience, and so on. At the end, the government either fall or capitulate.
Just hours after the vote, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu extended a hand to the opposition on national TV.
I say to the opposition leaders, you can continue to argue, you can continue to fight, but you can also do something else. You can reach agreements about what to do next. Let's come to an agreement. This is my call to you, and I extend my hand to call for peace and mutual respect within us.
Opposition leader Yair Lapid announced he will challenge the legislation in the Supreme Court. That could set up a major showdown between the justices and the legislature in the coming months. In the meantime, demonstrations continued throughout the night in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Protest leaders say their fight has just begun. And former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert told the media that Israel is now entering a period of civil disobedience and even civil war. However, Prime Minister Netanyahu began his message with a hopeful note. He was moved when he saw a video of demonstrators from both sides in a train station, with advocates of judicial reform going up and opponents going down. Despite their differences, they began to reach out and shake hands, as Netanyahu said, not as enemies, but as brothers. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And this week's special guest is prophecy expert John Hallows, also a lawyer as well. And he's joining us from a golf course in Ohio. John, it's great to have you on Behind the Headlines. Great to see you. I'm sorry that we missed you when you went up to Scotland back in June, but it's great to have you on the programme.
It's really good to be with you, Simon.
And John, from your legal experience and background, can you try and unpack and make sense of all the confusion surrounding the Israeli government's decision as they passed legislation last week to reform Israel's judiciary?
Yeah, well, the first thing that they did last week was to pass a law regarding the reasonableness test, and that's sort of where all the problems began. Back about 1993, a Supreme Court justice named Barak brought in a reasonableness standard, and it was a way for the people on the left in Israel to gain more political power. Very similar to what happened in the United States with the growth of individual rights and people demanding their rights. The problem was that labor had controlled Israeli politics, the left, the socialist left, that controlled Israeli politics for about 35 years from the foundation of the country until 1993. They were starting to decline. They were hitting a demographic wall because of the incredibly high birth rates among the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox factions in Israel. The left will never come back to power. The only way they can cling to power is by taking control of the judiciary and sort of making the judiciary like a super legislature, super executive branch. So the first chink in that, knocking down that wall, was the reasonableness standard. So that's the first thing that the Netanyahu coalition, Likud, and several Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox parties that now control the Knesset, I think they have 64 seats out of 120. They're trying to knock that back. The Supreme Court has been able to sort of set themselves up as like I said, a super legislature or a super executive branch. They are able to use this reasonable test to say, well, this statute shouldn't be enacted. That statute's unreasonable. That minister should not serve in the cabinet because he has a prior conviction. And it's really sort of been weaponized against Benjamin Netanyahu, the longest serving prime minister in Israel. Netanyahu is not widely popular. He is as probably an adept a politician as anyone on planet Earth. And he was able to form a coalition with these right, Orthodox, religious, and ultra-Orthodox parties. One of the things, though, but even before Netanyahu and these parties started talking about judicial reform, everybody agreed in Israel that they needed to be judicial reform. But now that it's the ultra-Orthodox, everybody has their, we would say, knickers in a knot in Israel on the left, because they're afraid that the ultra-Orthodox are going to come in and essentially put the Torah in as the code of Israel and make it a religious state rather than a secular state. So that's the big rub right now. Most of this is anti-Netanyahu. He's had these, what I would only term, and I'm a lawyer, I've been through a lot of white-collar criminal cases. The indictments against Netanyahu, in my judgment, are completely bogus. they're weaponizing the system against him. And then they say, oh, Mr. Netanyahu, the attorney general, who's been removed from the executive branch, by the way, comes in and says, Mr. Netanyahu, you can't opine on judicial reform because you're in the judicial system as a criminal defendant under these indictments. It's identical to what they're doing to former President Trump here in the United States and people on the right in the United States. They're weaponizing the judicial system. So this is what the Netanyahu coalition is trying to do, is to try to reform that system. First thing will be the reasonableness standard. Then they're going to change the way judges are appointed. Right now, the left has made it so that only left-leaning judges get appointed to the Supreme Court and other judicial posts. And
which sounds reasonable, John. Yeah, I mean, it does sound. It sounds reasonable that reform needs to happen. It seems like there's been widespread agreement previously. What would you say, because so many people across Israel have been joining protests. This has been causing a lot of disruption for much of this year. There are even Jewish followers of Jesus who have expressed concern that this could lead to a more religious state that's ultra-Orthodox. What would your response be to them?
Well, the main problem is Israel does not have a constitution. So in the United States, similar to Great Britain, you have two houses of parliament. They just have one in Israel. And so that makes the parliament supreme. And because of the way the coalition rules work and forming coalitions, the minority parties have an incredibly outsized influence over, they have much more influence than they do their numbers would give them. So I understand the concern. It is a political process, but it seems rather silly to me for people to complain that democratically elected people are changing the way the government is running, and that's not a part of the democratic process. I mean, they were democratically elected. There was no allegations of fraud in the election. And yeah, they don't like what the people stand for. But people need to understand, even Christian religious, Messianic Jewish people in Israel and that type of thing. There is a push behind this that comes from the radical left. It's led by Ehud Barak, former prime minister, former defense minister. And he said when he was in the UK at Chatham House a few months ago, if you get about 10% of the people to oppose the government, you can tear the government down. This is really about changing the character and nature of the Jewish state of Israel. And a lot of people are saying they're on the verge of civil war. I understand the concerns, okay? But people need to fight that politically. You don't tear down the system. They're getting Moody's and all these people to change bond ratings. There was an article in the Times of London on Sunday that said there's going to be a mass exodus from Israel. I don't really think they have any data to back that up. The biggest concern right now, though, is that supposedly it could be a psyop from the left. They claim that there are thousands of reserve officers in the Israeli Defense Force and Israeli Air Force, a lot of pilots who are going to refuse to serve. In light of the continual probing and provocation of Hezbollah and Iran and Iranian proxies in Syria and Lebanon, excuse me, this is potentially a very serious defense situation for the state of Israel. It may be as serious as they've had since its foundation.
And John, thank you for explaining this very complex legal issue and how it touches upon Israeli society. But how does Benjamin Netanyahu now go about restoring calm and bringing Israeli society together? They're completely divided between the left and the right, the religious and the secular, Ashkenazi, Sephardi Jews together, with this looming threat of Iranian attack through its proxy terror organizations, Hezbollah and Hamas.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a good answer to that, because this is the division in societies between left and right, populist, non-populist, left-right it's all across societies and cultures everywhere. And I don't know how Netanyahu does that. Really, the people claim on the left, if Netanyahu just resigned and went away and retired to his home up in Caesarea, that everything would be fine. And I think that's just a bunch of nonsense. It's not true. The division is still going to be there. And the issue that Israeli society has to deal with is the fact that the birth rates are so high among the ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox parties that the demographics of Israel are never going to change. You layer on top of that the Abraham Accords, attempts to normalize things with Saudi Arabia. It is going to be a very bumpy ride for the near future in Israel, and I think really everywhere around the world.
John, we really appreciate your time to join us on Behind Headlines, and just a reminder to our viewers that they can watch your excellent prophecy updates live on YouTube every Sunday afternoon. So it's a pleasure that you could join us today, John.
Simon, it's always good to be with you. God bless.
Well, so grateful for that perspective as well from John there. Prior to the formation of the current government, and this was alluded to, there have been many opposition leaders, including Yair Lapid, Lieberman as well, Gideon Saar. They've all spoken out in favor of judicial reform. This is not new. Yet once it was Netanyahu, and this is the reality of it, once it's Netanyahu and a right-wing coalition that has both votes and motivation to advance these reforms, and this is, Simon, often how it works in the Middle East as a whole, but in Israeli society in general, things take time. Things take a degree of time to activate, and sometimes there's not the immediate motivation. There's a recognition something needs done, but there's not always the motivation to actually push it through. So Netanyahu has gone ahead with this coalition to try and push something through. The very same policy that opposition leaders have extolled now is being seen as somehow unkosher and as not right. It's not on. And a lot of that is because of the interpretation of it. There's suspicion that's inbuilt because of who is presenting it. If it was the left, okay, fine. If it's the right, well, okay, that they must have some insidious motivation. And that may be. But the left surely would have its own motivations for pushing it through as well. This is how politics work, and John is right that, it's a democratic process.
No, absolutely. So as we saw with the interview with John Haller, who's a legal expert, I mean, he's also mentioned the fact that this has also become very weaponized, and going over some of the similar points he made earlier, that in Israel there is no constitution, and are only basic laws that govern the country. With the no constitution and basic laws, and Israel's legal structure that governs the nation does not necessarily protect basic rights and freedoms. And then in 1993, the Supreme Court adopted the reasonableness standards under which the court could conduct a reasonable review. And this is the major problem of concern, because it means that the Supreme Court has overstepped its mark by examining current or previous government's policies that it doesn't accept, whether this is the drafting of IDF soldiers, whether this is moving the security fence in Israel, or the dismantling of Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria, all come under this reasonableness. We see the problems the Supreme Court has applied and far exceeded the original concept of reasonableness. Now, reasonableness has been extended to actions of the government, of the military, appointments of ministers, and most functions of government. The court is left-wing orientated, and the Supreme Court that controls 100% of who can be appointed at court and appoints those who share the same outlook and progressive left ideology. We've also witnessed over time the decline of the political left's ideologically and also in terms of demographics. And the parties of the right, secular, Likud, religious Zionists and ultra-Orthodox parties have effectively taken over the country. The left fear that Israel will become a religious state and that the communities in Israel are divided among secular, religious, Zionist, Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox and Arab lines.
This has been something that was always going to happen to some degree. I feel that there would have been protest from the ultra-religious side of things if the left was to push this through. The Middle East is generally, you use the term touch paper, there's a lot of stuff that can happen just over these decisions that's made. And indeed, there has been conflict between the ultra-Orthodox communities in response to protesters who are against. So that's some of what we've been seeing, and that's why it's an inflammatory term, but that's why even the term civil war has been presented.
Yep.
Now,
and the Attorney General also plays a major role in this, and this is also a bigger component. Do you want to unpack a little bit about the role of?
The Attorney General has been removed from the control and influence from the executive branch of the government, the Prime Minister office and cabinet. This has not occurred in any Western government. The Attorney General in Israel controls who can be appointed as ministers, one minister being removed from the government, even though he was democratically elected in November of 2022. So there's that concern that's been.
And that's the big difference, I think. I mean, usually when a government like, for example, the British government appoint an Attorney General, it's to effectively be the government's top lawyer on legal issues. And when the government gets into hot legal issues, it's the Attorney General that has to decide on the top legal issues or how best to protect the government. We saw this really play out over Brexit, about how to withdraw ourselves from the European Union and all the kind of legal plots that ensued. But in Israel's case, the Attorney General has supreme power. It's not there to support the government of the day, but it's effectively there to protect the ideology of the left and the power and authority of the Supreme Court.
Now, while most protesters are typical law-abiding Israelis, they care deeply for the state and its future. There's only a very small minority of individuals who inexplicably live in Israel who don't care about Israel and its future. But the organizers of the protest movement have demonstrated a willingness, whether in their own mind and in heart that's what's there or not, but a willingness really in action to really inconvenience people's lives, tearing the country to shreds in some ways, blocking roads to airports and emergency centers and whatnot, which is reprehensible. It's the sort of thing that if it happens here, we rightly complain of and say, no, that's not on. But for some reason, when it's occurring in Israel, people look at some of these actions, which are actually endangering some people's lives as well. Now, we have a news report from our good friends at CBN that show how massive protests have followed Israeli president's plea not to let a judicial reform issue divide the country.
Lights, we will go ahead. Help us save our democracy.
Demonstrators called for help outside the U.S. Embassy as tens of thousands from around the country gathered outside Israel's Knesset.
We came to demonstrate against the very aggressive legislation which gonna turn Israel from a liberal democracy into a fascist dictatorship.
Inside the Knesset, lawmakers introduced legislation to change the judicial system, which includes limiting Supreme Court power to overrule legislation and giving lawmakers more power over appointing judges.
I feel, we all feel that we're in a moment before a collision, even a violent collision, a barrel of explosives before a blast.
The divisive issue prompted Israeli President Isaac Herzog to address the nation.
The judiciary must be a home for the diversity of opinions in Israeli society. The fact that there is not enough diversity, for example, there are no judges of Eastern origin in the Supreme Court, bothers me a lot.
Herzog says the call for reforms is a product of imbalance between authorities and crossing boundaries that culminated in the 2005 Israeli pullout from the Gaza Strip and northern Samaria, known as the disengagement.
This pain of brothers and sisters is real. To reject it and ignore it is a big mistake.
Many opponents believe Prime Minister Netanyahu could use the changes to stop the trial against him. Others fear it might lead to religious law being imposed here.
The reason that there's mistrust here is because the Minister of Justice himself said that this reform was a 4-story building reform. And what we're seeing now is only the first floor. For the people of Israel, the population here, there's lack of transparency as to what the government is planning.
Advocate Yehuda Schaefer argues the Israeli political system has no checks and balances except elections and the Supreme Court.
We don't have a constitution. We don't have 2 houses of parliament. All the basic rights in Israel, like freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and many others, are written nowhere and have been created by the court in common law.
Simcha Rotman, who heads the Knesset's Constitution, Law, and Justice Committee, however, claims the Supreme Court has overstepped its boundaries.
And the court is biased. The court is canceling legislation by the Knesset for political reasons and does not defend human rights. For all those reasons, we need to reform the courts.
Rotman sees the changes as positive for all of Israel, from the economy to the fight against terrorism.
People will elect their representative, and their representative will push forward the policies that they are elected to do. A lot of changes, but the main issue is Israel will be a democratic, self-governed country.
Herzog says he met with many on both sides of the issue.
I state with certainty it is possible to reach a broad consensus which will put the citizens of Israel above all debate. Yes, it is possible.
While he's calling on the government to stop the legislation, Netanyahu's coalition has moved ahead while saying they are still open to dialogue with the left. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And that's thanks to our friends at CBN. That news item was a few months old when we first saw the big protests that were spread across Tel Aviv on the main highway in Israel and also in Jerusalem as well. And we know that things have become even more toxic since then. So according to my notes here, that under the coordination with Lapid, the failed former Prime Minister Ehud Barak and Israeli media industry are hungry to push Netanyahu from office. So a lot of this is motivation to get rid of Netanyahu and his coalition government. Pressure has been levelled on the government to drop the reform package by the Biden administration. So we're already seeing the influence, and particularly when we saw a couple of weeks ago that Israel's President Yitzhak Herzog had a state visit, we saw pressure from the Biden administration on Israel's legal reforms. So it's a few times that the US president has come out and spoken out against this. And so they're trying to use American jury, they're trying to use the president to put pressure on this government to stop bringing about the case for legal reform. We also see that American Jewish organizations, leaders, high-tech investors, international credit agencies and other entities are trying to push back on the government's ability to reform Israel's judiciary.
Simultaneously, the opposition organized an extremely well-funded protest movement, complete with the consistent unleashing of new organizations and campaign slogans printed on billboard-sized signage, as well as costumes aimed at feeding headlines and photo captions for domestic and international media. Protesters have repeatedly blocked highways, as well as Ben Gurion International Airport, much to the chagrin of residents and tourists who have been caught in now regular traffic jams over and above the ones that already existed already, which is anyone who's been there knows it can be catastrophic. But this is obscene because in any case, if you're crippling public infrastructure, you're putting people's lives at risk.
Absolutely. And we also see now that the Supreme Court will be discussing, I think, the proposed reform of the judiciary in the first week of September. and this could actually then provoke a constitutional crisis. And Israel says if Israel's Supreme Court, sitting as the High Court of Justice, strikes down the reasonableness law the Knesset acted on Monday, the 24th of July, it would create an unprecedented constitutional crisis, say legal experts. We're also seeing that the striking down of the law would give the court absolute power of a kind unknown in any Western democracies and trigger a fundamental constitutional crisis. In other words, the court has given itself an unlimited extra legal power to strike down laws that it could use here. And according to a Jerusalem think tank, they argued that the correct and democratic approach to reversing the reasonableness law for the next government to repeal it with enough votes in the Knesset, something that the National Unity Party, Benny Gantz, indicated would happen. So now we're talking about the Supreme Court rejecting this legislation that was passed through a democratically elected government in the Knesset. You can see why this could cause a huge constitutional crisis.
Well, should they strike down the law, this would be the very first time that the judicial branch has invalidated an amendment to one of Israel's basic laws, which these act as a sort of de facto constitution in the absence of such a document, a formal document. So this is the discrepancy. There will be some people who say, no, there is a constitution, but there's not a formal constitution. There are, however, documents that serve as de facto constitutions. This is what's taught in Israeli schools. This is what people will be aware of there. The question on everyone's mind is if the coalition government would respect that kind of ruling by the Supreme Court.
Unlikely.
Yeah, and so then what do you have? You do have a constitutional crisis. You have a very severe issue wherein you have two parties that are pitted against each other. And Guy Laurie, a research fellow at the Israel Democracy Institute, said it's difficult to say whether the coalition government would respect that kind of ruling. We have never been in that kind of extreme situation where the coalition does not respect a ruling by the Supreme Court on such a major constitutional issue.
Yeah, when the government is wanting to reform the judiciary and Supreme Court anyway, there'll be no, we're not having that. So, yeah, I mean, I also think a lot of this is also caused by how Israel was created as a modern state. I mean, effectively, most of the laws in Israel are based on the mandate laws. So, effectively, British laws is why when I went to university, I met a lot of Israeli students who were studying law had to study British law, right. Because that was a huge component of the mandate laws that Israel inherited. We know that Israel faced a war of independence in 1948. Attacked by 5 Arab armies and really kind of just surviving a war. And of course, now the state is 75 years old. Many of these issues haven't been dealt with and therefore coming to the fore. We see here that the Attorney General has also brought criminal charges against Benjamin Netanyahu. They have developed a strategy and a new doctrine that Netanyahu can't lead any of the political discussions on judicial reform because he's been indicted against him, which also explains why Netanyahu can't manage these legal reforms, and this is why it's another mess. We're seeing that much of what's happening in Israel is very much like what's happening in the US, the weaponization of the judicial process against former President Trump and politically conservative citizens that is a real threat to democracy. We see that there's a great danger with the protest that Israel is potentially heading for civil war. And there's a massive problem now with many reservists from the Israeli Defense Force and the Israeli Air Force refusing to be called up and could destroy Israel's armed services. Iran could deploy terror proxies to attack Israel, believing that she is weak and in a vulnerable position. And we really need to pray and step up our prayers for Israel at this very crucial time in Israel's history.
So with all of this in mind, just in summing up, the reality is Netanyahu does face criminal charges. He has faced allegations of corruption for a while and has successfully, to some degree, fought against those, but this continues. And so there's this strategy, essentially, that's been developed that keeps Netanyahu from leading any of these discussions on judicial reform because of that indictment against him. And so there's suspicion then that Ben Gvir, this extreme right-wing character who has said some absolutely reprehensible things in his career and done some things that have not been to the good of everyone in Israeli society. The fear is that he has an undue influence and that his grouping has an undue influence over these discussions. But there's not definitive proof of that. And
unlikely. I mean, he's the security minister,
exactly.
being in control of police. He wouldn't necessarily be involved in this. You probably have the Speaker of the House, of the Knesset, Amir Ohana, pretty much involved in this, and other legal experts. I think Likud would keep this within the realms of the Likud party. But because Netanyahu can't actually work and draft legislation himself, he can't lead the reforms, it's open up to huge confusion. It's all about interpretation.
Optics.
And that's the main thing. I think the reason why Israel's in the mess that she's in and is tearing a society apart is because it's about perception. And the reasonableness of all of this is to assume that the Supreme Court has far too much power in Israel and needs urgent reform in Israel to be a truly democratic country, to ensure that the Prime Minister can pass legislation without the Supreme Court blocking it. Yeah. So effectively, this is about how Israel's governed, Israel's democracy, and of course, the enemies of Netanyahu like to accuse him of endangering democracy when it's the left that's actually endangering Israel's security.
There is a case to be made that this can be weaponized in a negative way that leads the country into deeper corruption than's already there. But on the flip side, this could actually be the answer out of some of the corruption that's been there and lead to a greater, more stable society and economy. The problem is with this massive amount of infighting that's there, there's creating a very real problem wherein Iran may deploy its proxies against Israel. There may be ongoing problems that threaten from the outside as well. This is something that we need to watch and pray in regard to. But that's going to be it from myself and Simon for this evening on Behind the Headlines. We'll hope to see you, God willing, next week once more.